Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie Nofel, and here on YouTube I make different kinds of content from like vintage hauls, thrifting, mom lifestyle kind of vlogs, and DIYs. I'm kind of just like all over the place, and whatever I present to you is whatever my current obsession is, so take it as you will. But this video is a video that I have been thinking about making for over a year now. I have a 15-month-old son who you might see in this video. He and his dad right now are playing in our bedroom so that I can film this. I have the two cats out here with me, so you might see some cats running around. But this is a video I've been wanting to make for over a year and a half now. I've been planning on making this video soon after my son was born. When I was pregnant, I was making a lot of pregnancy videos, and so I was expecting to kind of continue that right after I had him, like maybe take a couple of weeks off and then film a birth story. And I've been planning on making that as positive as possible because I wasn't scared to give birth. I was planning on doing it as natural as possible, despite being in the hospital, because the plan was kind of have my first one in the hospital and then have all the rest in a birthing center after I'd given birth for the first time. But that's not how things worked out. So just a brief trigger warning before we actually get into my birth story. I had an emergency C-section, so this video is going to discuss that as well as the concept of death and dying. So just so you're aware, that is in this video. I personally do not like watching videos that talk about that currently. I find it pretty triggering. So if that's you too, just be aware before we get super into this video. But without further ado, let's get started. So I'm going to break this video up into kind of three parts, and that is my birth story and then kind of how I had planned on it going versus how it actually went, and then kind of moving on from birth trauma. So three different parts. I have about 3 pages of notes here, and that's just because I have been planning on doing this video for quite a while. So I just want to make sure I get everything in there that I want to say. So let's start with the beginning of my birth story. So on the day that my son was born, it was a Sunday, and I woke up around 3 a.m. that morning with a really sharp shooting pain in my abdomen. And I had taken a natural birthing course, and I found out that if you think you're in labor, the best thing you can do is go back to sleep. Because if you're really in labor, you're not going to be able to sleep through it. And so I got woken up, and I tried to fall back asleep. And then this started happening for about 2 hours, because I woke up around 3 a.m. I remember checking the time, and I was like, great. But this went on for about 2 hours, where I was waking up in pain and kind of breathing through the contraction and then trying to fall back asleep. Because I figured if I was really in labor, then I was going to need to get as much sleep as I could, because I was about to not get any sleep for a couple months. So I kind of labored by myself until around 5 a.m. Now, my husband and I at the time were on Sundays going to 7 a.m. Mass. We're the youngest people there, and that's just kind of what our routine was at the time. So I labored by myself until 5 a.m. when my husband Hence's alarm went off. And I didn't wake him up beforehand because I was able to breathe through the contractions by myself, and I figured that I would need him to be as rested as possible for when I was in labor later, when labor got more intense. So when he woke up, I remember telling him, we're not going to Mass today. And he was like, oh, and I was like, yeah, I think I'm in labor. So then, starting from around 5 a.m., we started texting the people who were going to be meeting us at the hospital eventually, which would be my mom and my friend Tyler. But I really wanted to labor at home as long as possible, because I figured the longer I labored at home, the less likely I was to get an epidural, which is true, but that plays into some things that happen later. So keep that in mind. So between 5 and around 1:30 when we left for the hospital, 1:30 p.m., I was spending my time walking between our living room where I am right now. We have the couch over here and our TV, and I was watching I Love Lucy on the TV because that's a comfort TV show for me. And then we have a bathroom over here through the store, and I was going and I was laboring in there as well. I had a dress hanging in there that I knew I was going to be wearing to my son's baptism, and so having that dress in there, I was able to look at it and work through and think through every contraction that I'm one contraction closer to meeting my son. I'm one contraction closer to meeting my son. At one point we did walk into our master bathroom where we actually used the bathtub, because if you've seen my cloth diapering video, I have a washing machine in here. So in that bathtub, we filled it up with some water, but I found that I really did not like laboring in water as much as I thought I was going to, because I really preferred having the counter pressure that Hens was doing that we'd learned in our natural birthing class, rather than laboring in water like I had been planning on doing. Around 1:30, my contractions were getting to over a minute long and about 2 minutes apart, and Hens was like, we gotta go to the hospital. And I was like, no. Because I wasn't exactly convinced I was in labor, because I was still able to walk and kind of talk through it. I was told that I would really know when I would be in labor, but I wasn't convinced. I was pretty sure that it was still false labor, even though looking back I was definitely in labor, and that I didn't want to go because I was worried I was going to get sent home. So we drive to the hospital, and we actually ended up having to turn around and come back because I forgot my wallet. Go figure. But so we get to the hospital, and this is kind of, here's what we were planning. The original plan, which I can put right here, was I wanted it to be unmedicated, free movement, and not on my back. I did not want any kind of intervention. If they're going to give me any kind of medication, I wanted it to be a local anesthetic and not an epidural, because I wanted to be able to walk around. I figured I would give birth and then get up and walk around pretty quickly afterwards. Well, that's not really what happened. So we arrived at the hospital around 1:50 or so, like 1:45 to 1:50. And we get into triage and we check in. And I remember at this point I'm having to stop and breathe through contractions and like crouch down and just kind of like squat and work through them. And I remember doing that in the parking lot, and then I did it when we got to triage and they took my weight, and then we got into the room, the triage room, and they put a monitor on. And the nurse who put the monitor on, I remember asking her, do you actually see the contractions? Are they there? And she was like, yeah, they're there. And then her face fell, and it was like all the air sucked out of the room. And she looked at the monitor, and I was like, what's wrong? And she was like, hang on. And she, I was like, what's wrong? And she was like, hang on. And she called someone else in to come and look at the readings. And then they started talking about, like, what do we do? And she was like, we need to get her into labor and delivery right now. And I was like, wait, what's happening? Because they weren't talking to me, they were talking to each other. And they ended up calling for a wheelchair, but the nurse who had put the monitor on decided to actually have me wheeled out on the gurney on the hospital bed that I was on already. So then they wheeled me into labor and delivery on that. And I was like, what's going on? What's going on? And they're like, something's wrong with the baby's heart. And so I got wheeled on the bed that I'd gotten on triage into labor and delivery. And when I was in there, in came the ward nurse, who was a younger lady, and she was looking at the contractions, and a bunch of other nurses came in, and hence ended up getting pushed away from the bed because they were surrounding me. And then my OB, who I had been seeing all throughout my pregnancy, came in, and they were discussing what to do, and they kept checking to see how dilated I was. So at this point, when I had arrived at the hospital and they first checked how dilated I was about 6 centimeters dilated, and at this point I was at 8.5 centimeters dilated. So I had dilated quite a bit in the time that I'd been there. And they were like talking about what to do, and they were like, we gotta break her water. And so they went to do it, and it was already broken. which I don't remember ever having it break. I don't know if it was a slow leak, but they're like, did your water break? And I was like, not that I know. And so then they're like, what do we do? And they ended up giving me a shot of something to try to slow my contractions down. And I remember just being in so much pain at this point and scared because I'm not understanding what's happening and no one's really telling me what's going on, that I didn't even really notice that they gave me the shot. And because there was no water, they ended up sticking like a little tube up and pumping water into me to try to fill the sac back up. I'm not entirely sure why they did that, but that's what they did. So because they still were not sure what was happening with Owen, they ended up sticking a monitor up, and rather than just the abdominal monitor, they ended up sticking a monitor up that attaches to the top of baby's head so that they can really get really good readings as to what's happening with his heart. And the OB, I remember her being like, stop pushing, because at this point I'm going through contractions so fast, and I'm like, I'm not, because I have this bad habit, even though it's not what I learned. When I am in pain, I hold my breath. So even though I wasn't pushing, I was holding my breath, and so they were under the impression I was pushing, but I wasn't. And the OB was finally like, we gotta go, we have to call it. And I remember being like, can I have an epidural, because I realized they're going to be doing a C-section. They're like, no, there's not enough time. So they called to have the operating room prepared, and they started like lifting the sides of the bed so I wouldn't fall off when they were pushing it, and hence was not allowed into the operating room with me. And so this is one of the few moments in my life where I was under the impression that I was going to die. And this is something that I've been struggling with a lot, is because at that moment I was not concerned about Owen. I was concerned that I was about to die, which is something that I've been working with my therapist on, because it just all happened so fast, and I know I probably shouldn't feel guilty about that, but I do. So I kissed Hans goodbye, like I thought I was never going to see him again, and they literally ran me to the operating room. Like, if you've ever seen like Grey's Anatomy or something like that, that's how it felt. Like, we booked it. As I am being ran to the operating room, I remember my OB holding my hand as we're running, and she said, this isn't your fault. There's nothing you could have done to prevent this. It's not because of you. And that's like really the thing that stands out to me from that moment. And I'm so thankful for her right in that moment. But we will get into some stuff later. But right in that moment, I really appreciate that. We got to the operating room, and I remember they had me move over, and they pushed this thing onto my mouth, and they're like, okay, you're gonna feel something hit your throat. And I was like, I'm gonna cough. They're like, you're gonna cough. And I was like, I'm gonna cough. And they stuck a catheter in, and I remember that out of everything was the most painful thing that happened that day, up to this point. So throughout all the contractions, sticking the catheter up hurt the most. And I remember looking around, and I'm surrounded by all these people in scrubs and in their operating outfits, and they put the thing over my mouth, and I went to sleep. Okay, so my son was born at 2:02, and I did not wake up for several hours. I think maybe 3 or 4 hours. I was still out of it. So I missed the first couple hours of my son's life, and so did Hence. He wasn't there for the birth. Neither, like, I was there, but I wasn't there, you know? So they took Owen. Owen was fine. He came out perfect. He didn't have to go to NICU or anything. They took him to Hens, and then I got stitched up, and I got wheeled back to the mom-baby ward, where I lay incapacitated until I eventually woke up. And I remember when I woke up, the first person I saw was my mother-in-law, and I was like, I'm alive. I wasn't sure who I was waking up to see right then, but I saw my mother-in-law. So Hence's parents were there, my parents were there, and there was Hence. And then I was like, I'm supposed to have a baby. And they were like, show Katie the baby. And Hence, like, lifted up Owen, and I remember me, like seeing, like, 3 babies just kind of floating around. But, so this part is kind of fuzzy for me. I don't really remember this. Some snippets I do vaguely remember is Hence's mom saying, he looks just like Hence. And I started crying because Hence got his name, because when he was born, he looked like his great-grandfather. So I was crying that my baby looked like an old man. And then, the nurse came in and pushed on my stomach to make sure my uterus was contracting. And because I had a general anesthetic and not an epidural or anything, at this point, as I'm waking up, all of the pain from the C-section and being cut open is hitting me. And so she goes to push on my stomach. I went to swing at her, and she was like, hold on to the side, hold on to the side. I vaguely remember that. And tells the story better than me, but that's what I recall. Then we got sent to the recovery area for a couple of days. So when you have so my goal originally been to be in and out, to be let go as soon as possible. And then, because I had a C-section, I had to be there longer. A couple of things happened. I had an amazing nurse. Her name was Linda, and I love her so much. She's the one who taught me through breastfeeding, because honestly, my lactation consultant, kind of useless. But she explained to me how to breastfeed and told me everything was okay. That based on everything that happened, nothing was my fault. So as we are sitting in the hospital, we were there for 2 days, and some things happened. I was absolutely traumatized. I could not sleep at all. I was checking on Owen every 5 minutes because I was convinced he was going to die. And that actually continued for several months after I had him. And honestly, still now, I will check on him several times a night, which I am working on, but we'll get into things that have helped me since then. But that first night was rough. And I mean, it was rough. We ended up calling an emergency in because I was trying to breastfeed him and I didn't know how to. And he ended up I think suffocating a little bit on my boob. And so we called it in, and they ended up running him out of the room to take him to the nursery and to check and make sure that his oxygen levels were okay. And so that was really scary. And then while I was there the next day, they ended up calling a code blue for the operating room, for labor and delivery operating room, meaning either a mama or a baby was code blue, And so that was incredibly traumatizing, and I was like, I need to get out of this hospital now. So I did everything possible to prove that I was good enough to go home. I remember standing up and walking around as soon as they took the catheter out, which, by the way, painful going in, painful coming out. The second they pulled it out, I was like, up and walking around. In fact, I startled the nurse because I was up so quickly and walking around. And 2 days I got sent home, where I got to shower because I was never told I could shower in the hospital until 20 minutes before I got let go. The nurse was like, have you showered? And I was like, no, because I wasn't told I could. And she looked super annoyed, and she was like, well, you can now. And I not with me. She was annoyed with her coworkers, and I was like, well, I'll just wait till I get home because now I'm gonna go home. But I got to shower and kind of just breathe normally for a little bit. And then all the 6-week postpartum baby blues started, which were very rough for me. Incredibly rough, honestly. When I think back to those first 6 weeks, you couldn't pay me to go back to them. They were awful. But at the same time, I have a cute kid, so I guess it's worth it, right? But so the whole thing was incredibly traumatizing, and I'm able to seem happier and more cheerful about it now. But like I said, that was 15 months ago. It's been over a year. Because I've thought about making this video off and on, and every time it would just make my heart beat really fast, and I would start to feel like I couldn't breathe. And now I want to get into some things that have helped. The most recent thing that I did to help out was I got a new OB. I got a new OBGYN. Even though my OB was great right in that moment when she told me this is not my fault, when I went to my 6-week appointment, I did not get debriefed on anything that had happened, and she was really downplaying all the feelings that I had, because I expressed to her that I was not doing great from it, and I was pretty traumatized, and she sat there laughing, saying like, oh, well, it all worked out, like, everything's fine. There's no need to feel that way, everything's okay. And I remember that really hurt, because she was someone who I'd been with through the whole pregnancy, and even though I was a number, it didn't work out the way she had my birth plan, and she knew that that's not how I had wanted it to go or planned for it to go, and then she just brushed it off. And I remember that hurt a lot, and it made it really hard for me. I never wanted to go back to an OB, even though I do want more kids. And in the state of Arizona, you cannot, after you have a C-section, you cannot give birth in a birthing center. So not only was my original birth, my first birth, messed up, that changed my plan for all my future children. And so having my OB just laugh it all off didn't help. So, and then there were some other things that happened with that. So anyways, a year goes by. About a month and a half ago, I was talking to my therapist, and I was like, I really need to go and see an OB, but it's really triggering for me because I don't want to go back there. So finally, I talked myself into scheduling an appointment with a new OB who delivers at a different hospital. And I was so anxious about that appointment. I seriously considered canceling it. Hence had to go with me to the office, because I don't know if I would have actually gone in if he hadn't been with me. And when I met her and I asked her, the first thing I asked her, I was just there for an annual, but the first thing I asked her was, do you support VBACs? And she was like, yes, absolutely, they're great when they work out. And I was like, okay. And she was like, let me look at your chart. And she, over a year later, sat down with me and she broke down what happened based on all the notes that she had. And she was like, I think you're a great candidate for an eventual VBAC. And I was like, great. And so she wrote it all down in my chart that I am a perfect candidate for a trial of labor in the future. I just have to wait a certain amount of time before I do a trial of labor, so before I can get pregnant again. And I'm not quite at that threshold yet. But it was just really reassuring to have her sit down and talk to me about what had happened and how it didn't have to do with me. It had to do with Owen and his inability to cope with labor, and that there was no reason to not do a trial of labor in the future, when my first OB had said that she didn't really support VBACs. So just having a new OB who is supportive and delivers at a very VBAC supporting hospital was a great peace of mind for the future, because while my birth and everything is in the past, I'm planning on having more kids, so the same situation feels like it's in the future as well. So the very first thing that I did when I was about 3 days postpartum is I started taking walks. Very just brief walks. There was a food truck place down the street from us that was called The Pit, where a bunch of food trucks would come, and Hans and I walked down there about 3 days postpartum. It's about a half mile there and a half mile back, so about a mile there and back. And that first day just made me feel so much better, just being out and about. And then from then on, we started walking at different parks, mostly at a park that is close to my grandparents' house, because I like that area, and so we would walk there. And since then, we started walking further and further and further, which has also led to me losing about 30 pounds since when I had Owen to now. And I have lost weight compared to my pre-pregnancy weight to now. I'm about 20 pounds lighter. So nice side effect, but that definitely was not originally the goal of that. It was just to get out. So the next step that I did was I went to the core recovery course with this amazing woman who I found out also had a C-section, and honestly just knowing that made me feel so much better, because she honestly, I look up to her so much. And just knowing that she had also had a C-section under different circumstances, but still a C-section, and she's just such a strong person, made me just feel a lot better. And so that course and her in particular were very healing for me, just in general. And if you are in my area, I'm in Southern Arizona, I will leave her info linked below, and here is her Instagram right here. I love her very much, and she's still someone I look up to today, and I bother her quite a bit, just randomly. So after that, at this point I've been walking. I did this core recovery course, and the next thing that I did was we started hiking, and just being in nature and walking around it made me feel so much better. Just moving my body and not being in my own head helped so much with moving on from what was honestly a very traumatizing experience. So at this point, I'm about 4 months postpartum, and I am still having a lot of anxiety similar to like the baby blues. So at this point, I've gone from being in like the baby blues, which is the typical 6 weeks, to it has extended past that. And so I go and I see my general physician, and I tell them what's happening and that I don't feel like I am functioning the way I should be, and they immediately attempt to put me onto medications. Now, if you spend any time on my channel, you'll kind of know that I'm not really into that. Like, I wanted everything to be natural, and that extends past, even though my birth didn't work out, I don't want to go onto medications now. So I get referred to a therapist. So I start going to therapy, which is very helpful. I highly recommend it. If you don't have any issues, I still recommend you go see a therapist. But if you do have like anxiety or depression, I do recommend going to a therapist. And if you are taking medication, a therapist on top of medication will do great. But with this therapist, after I get to know her, I found out that she had an emergency C-section very similar to mine. And so her kind of specialty is birth trauma. And so with that, we started EMDR, and I'm still currently doing EMDR actually, and it just helps me process through everything that happened so that I can take my worst pain, worst fear that I can possibly imagine and just bring it down so that I can go from being traumatized to still having the memory, but it not affecting me the way it currently does. And I can honestly say that it has been helping a lot. And then one very last thing that helps me, like, even now when I'm not having an anxiety attack over the birth or anything like that, just anxiety in general, because I do struggle with that in general. I did before I had Owen, and it kind of doubled since the C-section, is if I'm in the middle of a panic attack, I need to get out of the house, and I will literally like go to Kroger. I will just walk around and see other people living their life. And I don't really know why, but just seeing other people living their own lives and realizing that, yeah, my life's important, but this is definitely not the end of the world. Even though it might feel like it to me, seeing that other people are living their own lives and it doesn't affect them helps. I don't know how to explain it, and it doesn't really sound like it's that helpful now that I'm saying it out loud, but it is a coping mechanism for me. That was a lot. I think I've covered everything. Let me see. Yeah. That's my birth story. That's all of it. Yeah. It feels really good to have made this video. This is also kind of healing in a way, because I had been planning on filming a positive birth story and just continuing my pregnancy content, and then the complete opposite of what I expected to happen happened. And so being able to actually sit down and talk about it makes me feel a lot better in general. In a lot of ways, I felt like I had failed, and going to therapy has helped me realize that I didn't, even though sometimes it does feel like it. Thank you so much for being here. This is kind of a heavier video than what I typically do, but I am glad you stuck with me all the way through, and I will leave some resources down below, and I will be seeing you in my next video. Toodles!